Alrighty, hello. We back. Week 3, reading the Forbidden Fruit love stories from the Underground Railroad. My name is Symba Luna. If you'd like to hire me for voice acting and narration, please email the Symba Luna Show at gmail.com. Let's get cozy, grab your drinks, and let's get into it. Today, we are reading the 5th chapter of this book. We're not going to make it through all the stories, so you should grab the book and read it yourself. But this 5th chapter, the story is called Even a Blind Horse Knows the Way. Daddy Grace drove his cart into the woods with a runaway slave crouched beside him, chains dangling from the fugitive's arms and legs, and a pistol in his hands. One of the rioters held a sword to Grace's head, urging him to hurry to the river. He pushed his horse harder and harder, outrunning the shouts and screams of a rock-flinging, curse-tossing, anger-spewing, blood-seeking mob. His horse was blind as a wall, as sightless as shoes, but it knew the way to freedom. Americans have rioted about all sorts of things, including horse stealing, the military draft, taxes, trade policies, racial tensions, umpires' decisions, sports victories, sports losses, and assassinations of heroes. When Presbyterian minister Sylvester Graham urged Americans to shun meat and alcohol and eat only home baked whole wheat bread, his advice so angered bakers, butchers, and saloon keepers that riots erupted wherever Graham spoke. In New York in 1817, an entertainer's refusal to sing a requested song triggered a riot. In October 1834, 40 homes were torched in Philadelphia's black community during riots in support of slavery. In October 1835, famed abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison had to be rescued from a Boston mob angered by his insistence that all men were created equal. But the 400 or 500 blacks who milled around the small Detroit jail on 2 June days in 1833 didn't bash heads, disable stagecoaches, and swing swords because they feared competition from home bakers. They didn't switch identities like the characters in Shakespeare's romantic comedies so they could string up horse thieves or support slavery either. Nor was it taxes that made them arm themselves with clubs, sticks, pistols, and rocks, assault Sheriff John M. Wilson, and drain all the courage from his deputy. The drama that led Black Detroiters and Canadians to set fires, go to jail, flee temporarily to Canada, and start building the foundations for their own anti slavery church began with a love affair between two extraordinary escaped slaves. Their names were Thornton and Rutha Blackburn. After running away together from Louisville, Kentucky, and marrying along the way, the Blackburns arrived in Detroit in 1831. Neither city was ever quite the same again. Thornton had lived an uncertain life, passing from one pair of hands and one set of possibilities to the next. He had been born in Maysville, Kentucky, around 1813, but became the property of Dr. Gideon Brown in Hardinsburg, Kentucky. When Dr. Brown died in 1829, Thornton became the property of the doctor's wife, Susan Brown, who moved to a farm outside Louisville. In the spring of 1831, Brown hired out Thornton as a porter at Wirtz and Reinhardt's dry goods store in Louisville, a city where slaves about to be shipped south waited in iron-barred coops, and men and women in chains marched up Main Street to board boats. It was common practice to hire out slaves not needed at home in order to produce extra income. Thornton might have carried crates and boxes and helped deliver merchandise to people's homes. However, hiring out slaves fostered independence. Away from their masters, slaves' vision of the world widened, along with their knowledge of geography, rivers, and escape routes. As both Thornton and Rutha would have been aware, Kentucky slaves didn't only work in fields and homes. They built bridges and canals, cooked, cleaned, and waited tables in restaurants and hotels, delivered products to market, rode and groomed racehorses, occasionally delivered mail, and were guides at some tourist attractions, including an artesian well in Louisville. Marion Lucas, author of A History of Blacks in Kentucky, even tells the incredible story of a slave in Louisville who worked as a paralegal for his master. When his owner put him up for auction in 1849, the owner advertised him as good, rough lawyer who could take depositions, decipher legal writings, and interview witnesses. It is likely that during this time, Thornton met Rutha, a light skinned Creole West Indian slave woman who was 9 years older than him and had plenty of sass and style. She had worked as a nurse for George and Charlotte Baucus of Baucus and Bell Dry Goods Company in Louisville. Both owners had died, and Rutha, like Thornton, had no idea what shape her future might take. After the sale of the Baucus estate, Rutha became the property of Virgil McKnight, future president of the Bank of Kentucky. Hi! On July 3rd, 1831, Thornton Blackburn ran away from Susan Brown, his owner. He took Rutha with him. It's not known why they decided to run at that particular time, but as city slaves, they would have heard stories about free North and about Canada, where in 1793, the government had stopped allowing slaves to be brought into the country. Perhaps Rutha was upset at being sold away from family and friends. Perhaps Thornton, having slipped a small glass of freedom in downtown Louisville, longed for a full bottle. Or perhaps one or both of them had reason to fear being sold down the river to the slave markets of Natchez or New Orleans and ending up on a cotton or cane plantation, where their lives would be toil filled and probably short. Whatever the reason, on the day before Independence Day, Thornton and Rutha declared themselves both free and independent. They left Louisville together. You couldn't really call it running away. They had too much confidence in themselves to skulk in the woods or sneak across rivers in skiffs. On July 3rd, 1831, they took a ferry across the Ohio River to Jeffersonville, Indiana, a river town famous for steamboats and shipyards, and the place where Methodist preacher Calvin Fairbank would be arrested 20 years later for taking a slave named Tamar across the Ohio. In Jeffersonville, Thornton and Rutha flagged down the Versailles, a steamboat built in Cincinnati in 1831. It was just leaving Louisville for Cincinnati. Though they were fugitive slaves, and though Kentucky law forbade taking slaves from the shores of the Ohio River opposite Kentucky, they had no trouble boarding the ship. They also had no trouble dazzling the captain and crew. They were, by all accounts, two of a kind. They both had perfect manners and a sheen of elegance, and Rutha, a head-turning beauty, swished around in a black silk dress. Thornton also carried himself like a man with a sense of importance. This was noted in the runaway slave ad his owner ran for him. The July 7th, 1831 fugitive slave notice published in the Louisville Public Defender offered a $25 reward for a colored man named Thornton, who stood about 5 feet 9 or 10 inches, was stout, had a yellow complexion and light eyes. He had left wearing a blue cloth coat, boots, pantaloons, and a black hat, and was said to be of good address, meaning he carried himself well and knew how to impress people. The officers of the Versailles took the pair for free blacks and let them aboard while the boat was floating in the Ohio, a short distance above Jeffersonville. Years later, they would pay for that slip, for helping the Blackburns escape The steamboat company owners and the ship's master were forced to pay Virgil McKnight and Susan Brown $400 each. The owners of the ferry boat that took them to Jeffersonville were found to have violated an 1824 statute. A witness swore that he saw the slaves on the boat before it left the Kentucky shore, and another witness swore that he had since seen the slaves in Canada. However, when the Blackburns escaped in 1831, Susan Brown's nephew, William Oldham, immediately began tracking them, catching the next steamboat for Cincinnati. He found the Blackburns' names on a logbook for the stagecoach to Sandusky, but gave up the chase, figuring they would beat him to their likely destination, Canada. Ohio members of the Underground Railroad likely advised them about which coaches to take on the road to freedom, according to historian Carolyn Smarts. After reaching Sandusky, they boarded another coach for Detroit, then capital of the Michigan Territory. As a Michigan city, it was part of the Northwest Territory, which under the Ordinance of 1787 prohibited slavery. The couple arrived in Detroit on July 18th, and Thornton soon found work with the local stonemason, Thomas Coquillard. They fit right into a black community that was still very small. In 1830, a year before their arrival, there were only 261 free blacks in the entire Michigan Territory and 32 slaves, holdovers from the days when the area was British ruled. An estimated 50 black families or 250 black individuals lived in the city of Detroit. The Blackburns moved within this small, tight circle, attending church and creating friends. No doubt they learned that they were not the only fugitive slaves to pass through or remain in Detroit, a city that would become the end of the line for thousands of runaways and become known on the Underground Railroad by the code name Midnight. However, in the fall of 1831, the Blackburns' free life became endangered. Thomas J. Rogers, a friend of Susan Brown's, visited Detroit and ran into Thornton Blackburn. He talked with the fugitive and learned that his wife was with him. For unknown reasons, Rogers waited 2 years before reporting his discovery to authorities in Kentucky. Once the Blackburns' whereabouts were revealed, though Susan Brown and Virgil McKnight hired Benjamin G. Ware and Talbot Oldman as agents. Once the Blackburns' whereabouts were revealed, though, Susan Brown and Virgil McKnight hired Benjamin J. Ware and Talbot Oldham as agents to recover the pair and return them to Kentucky. On June 14th and 15th, 1833, Ware and Oldham appeared before Henry Chipman, Justice of the Peace for Wayne County, Michigan, with proof that the Blackburns were fugitive slaves. Chipman issued warrants for their arrests, and Sheriff John M. Wilson placed them in the county jail, then on Gratiot Street, for safekeeping. They sat in separate cells, waiting for their free lives and most likely their lives together to end. Under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and the Territorial Act of 1827, Michigan had to send any proven runaways back to their Southern owners. Also, Wilson and his deputy allegedly were promised $50 each for bringing the Blackburns to the dock. However, Detroit's black community had different plans for the couple. They did not see Ware and Oldham as respected representatives of authority. They saw them as slave catchers, their sworn enemies, and their worst fears brought to life. Whether fugitives or freeborn blacks, they identified with the Blackburns on a level almost too deep for words, realizing they, too, could easily wind up in jail or on a southbound ship. Detroit was free territory, but the number of advertisements for fugitive slaves in the Detroit Gazette had climbed during the early 1820s as a constant reminder of the fate that might await fugitives. Hi! Also, in April 1827, a law to regulate blacks and mulattoes and to punish persons who kidnapped them had been enacted. Under this law, every black or mulatto who came into the territory after January 1st, 1828, was supposed to post a bond with the clerk of the county court for $500. Few, if any, blacks posted this bond, but the law made it possible to force out of the territory any black person considered undesirable. No wonder a steady and angry hum of protest rose from the section of the courtroom occupied by blacks during the Blackburn's hearings. On the evening of June 15th, 1833, several black Detroiters decided to take matters into their own hands. They met at the home of Benjamin Willoughby, a real estate speculator, financier, and owner of a lumber business, who probably came to Detroit from Kentucky between 1817 and 1830. He had worked as a laborer and acquired some money, often lending it to others. At his home, participants hatched a plot to free the Blackburns. The plan put Willoughby's own property and even life at risk. Sheriff Wilson allowed Mrs. Caroline French and Mrs. Tabitha Lightfoot into the jail to visit Rutha Blackburn. The trio remained together until near dusk. Caroline French was the wife of George French, and Tabitha Lightfoot was married to Madison Lightfoot. Both men were either porters or waiters at Detroit's Steamboat Hotel at the corner of Randolph and Woodbridge Streets near the Detroit River. The men held positions that gave them access to the city's power brokers. Madison Lightfoot had married Tabitha Smith at St. Paul's Protestant Episcopal Church in 1831, the same year that the Blackburns arrived in Detroit. Caroline French had powerful connections as well. Her father was Cornelius Leonard Lennox, who had come to Detroit from Newton, Massachusetts with Governor William Hull and bought a farm from the family of John Askin, an English loyalist who made a fortune that he partly abandoned when he moved to Canada and began living on the banks of the Detroit River. According to historian Arthur LeBrew, Caroline French also was the cousin of Boston activist Charles Lennox Remond, the first African American to appear as a regular lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, and the man who, in 1842, appeared before the Legislative Committee of the Massachusetts House of Representatives to support people protesting segregation in travel accommodations. By the following year, the segregation had stopped. With all this history sitting on her shoulders, Caroline French was prepared to become the city's first Black heroine. She changed clothes with Rutha Blackburn, who walked out of the jail with Tabitha Lightfoot. The three women wept as they parted. Friends then whisked and disguised Rutha Blackburn across the Detroit River to Canada. While taking breakfast to the prisoners, the deputy sheriff discovered the switch. He rushed over to the Steamboat Hotel to inform George French and Madison Lightfoot of the trick their wives had played. They were a parcel of hellcats, the deputy sheriff said. The two men denied knowing anything about it. When Sheriff Wilson heard about Rutha Blackburn's escape, he threatened to send Caroline French to Kentucky as a substitute. It was no empty threat. People in Louisville would have crowded the public square for a chance to watch Mrs. French sold as Rutha's stand-in. Had such a sale taken place, it might have resembled a 19th century lynching with thousands of spectators yelling for blood, or at least signs of fear. However, Caroline French's father, Cornelius Leonard Lennox, a free Black man with land and political ties, threatened to intervene. Meanwhile, George French was able to appeal to General Charles Larned and obtain a writ of habeas corpus to halt Caroline French's transfer to Kentucky. While out on bail, she fled to Canada and spent several months there. In the meantime, The Kentucky slave catchers shifted their attention to Thornton Blackburn, figuring it was better to take home half a prize than nothing. On Monday, June 17, 1833, Thornton Blackburn stood at the door of the Detroit jail in leg irons, guarded by Sheriff Wilson and his deputy as he waited for transportation to the steamboat docks. He was scheduled to sail aboard the steamship Ohio to Cleveland at 4 p.m. from the Howard and Waterman's dock at the foot of Randolph Street. The sheriff had been warned that black Detroiters planned to rescue Thornton, but he held up his riding whip and announced that he could scare every nigger that would be there with this. That afternoon, a crowd of blacks and mulattoes armed with sticks, clubs, knives, pistols, swords, and other weapons gathered around the jail of the Gratiot Street between Farmer and Farrer. Later the site of the downtown branch of the Detroit Public Library. They demanded Blackburn's release. I know, right? They demanded Blackburn's release. Trying to cool their fire, Sheriff Wilson walked outside 3 times to talk to the mob, but they continued to hurl threats and brandish weapons. Blackburn then showed the same wiliness, and boldness that had allowed him to escape from slavery. He volunteered to talk to the crowd, saying it wasn't worth having so much trouble on his account. The sheriff agreed, and Blackburn strode to the front steps of the jail where someone handed him a pistol. He pointed the cocked weapon at the deputy sheriff and cried, "Stand back, goddamn you, I will blow you through." The deputy sheriff retreated into the jail, leaving the sheriff to face the mob alone. While Blackburn struggled with the sheriff for Blackburn's gun, the crowd shouted, "Shoot him! Blow him through!" Blacks rushed from their hiding places, carrying clubs, knives, bayonets, pistols, and swords. The leader was reportedly a one-armed boss barber named John Cook. A boss barber being a man who cut the hair of both blacks and whites. Some women carried stones in their handkerchiefs. Some 400 people, more than the entire black population of the Michigan Territory, moved toward the jail. The Detroit Courier claimed that a large contingent of blacks had come over from Canada to take part in the uprising, including members of the Negro settlement near Malden, composed mostly or almost exclusively of fugitive slaves. An elderly woman carrying a stake wrapped with a white rag led the charge. Lewis Austin half carried and half dragged Blackburn into the stagecoach that had been brought to the jail to transport Ware, Blackburn, and the sheriff to the dock. As had probably been planned at the meeting at Willoughby's home, some women had removed the linchpin from the vehicle to disable it. Blackburn hid inside the disabled stagecoach. During the melee, an elderly black man called Daddy Grace, in some accounts, and Daddy Walker in others, was forced to back his horse-drawn cart up to the jail steps. An elderly black woman known as Sleepy Polly, who had never before shown a flicker of life, grabbed Blackburn and dragged him into the cart. Meanwhile, the sheriff's teeth were knocked out and his skull fractured with a large stone. As the sheriff fell, he fired his pistol and someone clubbed him in the head, knocking him unconscious. In about a year, Sheriff Wilson died, apparently never recovering from his wounds. The horse-drawn cart carrying Blackburn disappeared into the nearby woods. His escorts were Austin, Prince Williams, Peter Sands, Alexander Butler, John Lloyd, and Madison Mason. The fugitives and his conspirators stopped in the woods long enough to remove Blackburn's leg irons and then rode on to the Detroit River. Just as Blackburn climbed into the boat at the Detroit River, someone gave him a gold watch so he could pay the boatman. He crossed the river to Canada where in 1793, the government of Upper Canada, which mostly consisted of Ontario, had begun the process of freeing slaves. It ruled that while those enslaved would remain so, Any slave who entered the territory would become free. Within a decade, Lower Canada, including Quebec and the Maritimes, would pass similar legislation. The Blackburns' escapes had repercussions that flowed on into the 20th century, tearing apart old ways of life and creating new ones. In Canada, the Blackburn incident became the first test of an extradition treaty Upper Canada and the United States had signed in February 1833. Since escaping slavery was not a crime in Canada, other charges had to be brought against the Blackburns. They were accused of inciting a riot and arrested and jailed in Sandwich. The territory of Michigan moved swiftly to extradite them. Acting Governor Stevens T. Mason, born in Virginia and only 22 years old in 1833, sent all of the relevant documents to Sir John Colborne, Lieutenant Governor of the province of Upper Canada. The Canadian government refused to extradite Thornton and Rutha Blackburn. Lieutenant Governor Colborne argued that they had committed no crime punishable under Canadian law. After their release from jail in Sandwich, the Blackburns decided to stay in Canada, where freedom was already on its feet and walking about. For a short time, they lived in Amherstburg, on the Canadian side of the Detroit River, a well-known haven for fugitives. By the 1850s, in fact, Amherstburg would have such a large fugitive slave population that a longtime resident would compare them to 1834. That a longtime resident would compare them to the plague of frogs that rained on Egypt in Bible stories. However, in 1834, the year slavery officially ended in Canada, the Blackburns left Amherstburg. Given the notoriety of their case and the persistence of their Kentucky owners and pursuers, they must have realized they remained in danger in a riverfront community. Detroit steamboat owner Sylvester Atwood could have told them all about that. In the 1840s, slave catchers fooled Atwood, who was white, into taking them on a Detroit River cruise to Amherstburg, supposedly so they could lap up some sunshine. When he discovered they were hunting slaves, Atwood became so riled that he placed an advertisement in a newspaper describing how he had been hoodwinked. He also joined the anti-slavery movement. John Daddy Hall was another former slave who knew from personal experience that Amherstburg wasn't always safe. Slave catchers had stolen him from his home in Amherstburg and sold him in Kentucky. In the 1840s, he escaped to Canada, but didn't stop until he reached Owen Sound, 100 miles northwest of Toronto. The Blackburns headed for Toronto, a center of Black culture in Canada West until the 1850s. Toronto's Black community supported church-related groups, literary societies, temperance groups, the Upper Canada Anti-Slavery Society, and the Provincial Freeman, a militant Black abolitionist newspaper. Hi. Moreover, many Black immigrants had houses and businesses. Neither Thornton nor Rutha could write their names, but they still had plenty of hustle and shine. Thornton became a waiter at Osgood Hall, and the couple built a small frame house and a barn on the outskirts of town on what would become the front playground of Saxville Street School. The area was just marshland then, and a forest with a few streets snaking through it and a garden west of the house. The very poor Irish would move to this area later, but the Blackburns preceded them, moving there in 1834, the year the city was incorporated. In 1836, Thornton came up with an idea that would make him wealthy. He had noticed public transportation in cities such as Montreal and believed Toronto would embrace it. He got the pattern for a cab from Montreal and had a carriage built, painting it red and yellow and turning it into a cab for hire. It became the first cab company in Upper Canada, but others soon sprang up. Thornton parked his wooden carriage drawn by a single horse near St. James Cathedral at Church and Trinity. In a city where masses of mud often clogged the streets and where only the rich owned carriages and horses, the idea of renting a cab quickly caught on. I know, I gotta keep doing it. Like, I got you on whatever story you want me to read when I see you next time. Oh my gosh, that's so funny. It just reminded me how I used to do this. uh, yes. The idea of renting a cab quickly caught on. On the surface, the Blackburns lived what looked like a conventional life. But their Detroit adventures left an inevitable mark on both Thornton and Rutha, who changed their name to Lucy in Canada. Oh, wait, Thornton and Rutha, who changed her name to Lucy in Canada. The experience of being a fugitive slave marked for shipment back to Kentucky was not something they could shrug off or put behind them. Not when hundreds of people had risked their businesses and lives for them. Not when blood had spurted and fires had flared up in their names. When their taxi business succeeded, they remained in the same small frame house, buying the land they sat on and building small barn for their cab and horse. They lived simply, gardening, hunting, fishing, and pouring much of their company's profits into black self-help movements. When the North American Convention Against Slavery met at St. Lawrence Hall in downtown Toronto in September 1851, Thornton Blackburn attended it as a delegate. The city directories in Toronto for the years 1862 to 1890 call Thornton a gentleman, suggesting he no longer had to work for a living. He had retired from the taxi business in the 1860s. However, the cool nerve he had displayed during the Detroit uprisings never left him. In the 1840s, he reportedly returned to Kentucky to rescue his mother, an almost unbelievable event considering the circumstances surrounding his own dramatic escape in Kentucky from Kentucky slavers. Yet, according to historian Carolyn Smards, the family plot in Toronto contains the remains of a woman named Libby Blackburn, who was 80 when she died in 1855. When Thornton Blackburn died in 1890, he left his wife not only his property, but $17,000, which I'm sure is a lot of money in 1890. He was buried in the Toronto Necropolis Cemetery, and his monument bears the inscription, "Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord." His wife sold their home and moved to another part of the city. By the time the woman known as Lucy Blackburn died in 1895, the Blackburn money was gone. And for many years, Canada forgot all about this childless couple who couldn't write their own names, but had traveled so far and achieved so much. However, their legacy came to light in 1985 when a group of professional and amateur archaeologists, many of them school children, dug up the schoolyard at the corner of Eastern Avenue and Samoak Street on the edge of central Toronto, searching for the remnants of the Blackburns' house. By that time, stories about the Blackburns had appeared in Detroit magazines and newspapers. The excavation on the grounds of the Sackville Street School in Toronto, where the Blackburns' home once stood, turned up no fancy silver or other glittery artifacts. No sign that the couple had spent any time hosting dinner parties and sampling the high life. Ironically, historical markers in Louisville, the city from which the Blackburns escaped, now honor them. Similar markers in Louisville also claim that slave traders were often social outcasts avoided by all but fellow traders. That sounds like a lie. Meanwhile, in Detroit, the passions and protests roused by the Blackburn riots produced lasting results. White mobs rioted all over America in the 1830s, but the Blackburn riot was Detroit's first black uprising. It seemed to go on and on. On July 11th, 1833, someone set the Detroit jail on fire, but it was quickly extinguished. 4 days later, the stables adjacent to the jail burned down and $150 worth of horses were destroyed. On July 25th, Marshall Chapin, mayor of Detroit, asked Secretary of War Lewis Cass to send a detachment of troops to Detroit, until the excitement has subsided. A citizens committee appointed to investigate the Blackburn riot recommended, among other things, a 9 p.m. curfew, the maintaining of city guards, and the establishment of an efficient police force. However, the city really didn't improve its police force until after the infamous Faulkner riots of 1863. In that case, a black man named William Faulkner was tried and convicted of raping two girls, one white, one black, and sentenced to life in prison. When a white mob tried to lynch him, police fired into the crowd, killing one and wounding six others. The mob then swept into the Near East Side, attacking blacks at random and burning buildings. Two victims of the violence later died. Several whites tried to disperse the mob, but it took federal troops to end the violence. In 1870, Faulkner was finally released when his accusers admitted they had lied. However, after the Blackburn riots, patrols kept watch on Detroit and rounded up all blacks on the streets and in the woods. Black people weren't even allowed to dock their boats. Some 30 were imprisoned. Some had to leave Detroit, and others worked off their sentences by repairing the streets. Daddy Grace worked for 6 months. Accused of knowing who gave Blackburn a pistol, Madison Lightfoot spent 3 days in jail but refused to talk. George French headed for Windsor, Ontario, and Tabitha Lightfoot was fined for being a prime mover in the riot. Many others sought sanctuary in Canada until it was safe to return. Some Detroit employers who had previously hired black men and women refused to do so. Historian Norman McRae called it Negrophobia. When a citizens commission issued its report on the incident, it noted neither black Detroiters' habits nor their morals, with a few exceptions, make them a safe or desirable addition to our population. Now they say this part real quiet. In many ways, though, the Blackburn riots, like the fires in a foundry, welded Detroit's fledgling black community into something stronger and steelier. In a sense, the riot created the cohesion, the sense of coming together that makes a community. 3 years after the riot, Tabitha and Madison Lightfoot, Caroline and George French, and other participants in that disturbance helped found Second Baptist Church of Detroit, the oldest Black Baptist church in the state and the city's major stop on the Underground Railroad. Originally, Second Baptist's founders belonged to the mostly white First Baptist Church of Detroit, established by Baptist missionaries from New York State. Blacks had joined First Baptist as early as 1832, when William Butler was baptized 2 days after becoming a member. However, Black members grew weary of such indignities as being confined to the balcony rather than being allowed to sit downstairs, and of not being allowed to vote in the business meetings of the church. Madison Lightfoot, later ordained as an elder in Zion Baptist Church, was the chief spokesman when Blacks confronted First Baptist elders and told them Black members wished to leave. In 1836, 13 Black Detroiters asked for letters of dismissal from First Baptist Church so they could organize their own church. They also submitted a petition to the state legislature to form the Society of Second Baptist Church, formally organized in 1839. In 1839, the church established the first school for African American children, and its first pastor, the Reverend William Monroe, became known as an anti-slavery activist. Second Baptist also would spawn 30 or more other Black churches, including St. Matthew's Episcopal, founded by Reverend Monroe, and Zion Baptist, where George French became a deacon. In the next 3 decades, a cadre of Black leaders willing to risk their lives to help escaping fugitives would emerge in Detroit, all of them heirs to the Blackburn's legacy. They would include Monroe, Benjamin Willoughby, at whose house the Blackburn plot was hatched, his son-in-law, William Lambert, a free Black man from New Jersey, George de Baptiste, a Virginian who had run an Underground Railroad station in Madison, Indiana, and who owned a ship, the T. Whitney. William Webb, a light-skinned black man who passed for white to spy on slave catchers in taverns and pass on information to the Underground Railroad. And Obadiah Wood, a barber from New York. Others, black and white, Detroiters and Canadians, would join the struggle, including Seymour Finney, a white abolitionist who arrived in Detroit from Western New York in 1834. He owned a hotel and livery stable. According to legend, he hid fugitives in his stable while entertaining the men pursuing them in his hotel. Just as the Blackburns remained anti-slavery activists after moving to Toronto, Second Baptists remained a major force in the struggle for equal rights long after slavery ended. After the Civil War, the church played a key role in helping freed slaves find jobs and homes in Detroit. And in a February 1957 letter to the Reverend A. Banks Jr., then pastor of the church, civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, "On returning to my office, I found your letter with the enclosed check of $1,557.36 from Second Baptist Church on my desk. Words are inadequate for me to express my appreciation and the appreciation of the whole Negro citizenry of Montgomery for this great contribution. It comes at a time of real financial need. I think I am correct in saying that Second Baptist Church has contributed more to the work of the Montgomery Improvement Association than any single church in America. You can never know what this means to us. Americans have rioted for all kinds of reasons, including winning or losing a sports game, drunkenness, rumors of rape, and racial incidents. Unlike those incidents, the riot triggered by Thornton and Rutha Blackburn's imminent return to slavery did more than ignite fires and fights. It changed the Blackburns' lives and the lives of people in at least 2 cities, establishing an enduring tradition of Black self-help and struggle." Whew. More from Forbidden Fruit, Love Stories from the Underground Railroad. Thanks so much for joining in. We'll be back for one more story next week as we wrap up Black History Month. And again, if you'd like to hire me, Symba, for narration and voice acting, please email the Symba Luna Show at gmail.com. And I will see y'all again next week. Peace.